Okay.
Okay.
Right.
As I welcome everyone to another session of our African Studies Global Virtual Forum. The opening of today's session is going to be slightly different from the previous ones because apart from our invited guest, Professor Robbie Shilliam, Johns Hopkins University, who has kindly accepted our invitation to join us today, we have two other special guests. And now Makoni is going to introduce one of them, Professor Cheryl Sterling, Director of African Studies Program at Penn State University.
Mm-hmm. Good morning or good evening. It depends where you are in the world. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Sterling, who is the Director of African Studies here at Penn State. We are thankful for the support that the program is giving us in this African Studies Global Virtual Forum. So we thought that formally it would be good to invite her so that she can be able to situate for us the global forum within the vision of African studies at Penn State. Welcome. Thank you very much, Professor Sterling, for your support.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Excuse my lateness. I had the wrong link. So I had to scramble to find it in my email.
Okay.
So we can easily say that we're kind of living in the aftermath of the colonial encounter for the most part, or I could say maybe a colonially defined world. And whether we say that it's, we agree with the supposition that colonialism and it's the racial categorizations that we've inherited come from economic drivers, or these racial suppositions were led to domination and economic opportunities, it still brings us to this moment of protests that we see happening, protests and demands for change in our understandings and of the paradigms of Westernity. These kind of racialisms or racisms, which leads to many of our stereotypes. My particular areas, of course, are Blackness and Black subjectivity, which I call a denegatory Blackness, which also spawns, and again, a term of transcendent whiteness, has created, of course, collective issues that we're all grappling with to a certain extent. Albert Memmi so aptly named and operationalized the term a pyramid of tyrannies, which previously dominated groups. Well, he was talking about dominated groups, of course, and racism, but we can apply now to previously dominated groups as each are vying to reach the top of the very pyramid, the apex of the power scheme. So what does this kind of mean for us? You know, in these systems of domination across the board, whether racialized or not, we realize it's all about power. Who has the power to control everything, to control life, to control death, to control resources, to control all levels of currency. But with this epoch, we're seeing, or this moment in time, we're seeing kind of a mobilized force, a mobilized youth force in a very short period of time, who are wrestling with these monumental aspects of control. And as Dr. Makoni has asked me specifically to address African studies, here, what we find in academia are the more institutionalized aspects of control of knowledge and resources. And more specifically in Penn State with our program, as our goal is to grow our faculty and to strengthen our base and offer curricula that's more structurally integrates the content in ways that benefits our students. This institutionalized top-down model of knowledge and knowledge production resists transformation for a program such as ours. And what we see in our area, what's called Happy Valley, the youth have not caught up with the rest of the world to demand or call for change in the institutional order that would shift this type of distribution of knowledge. And while they address the larger macro structures attached to the globality of the struggle over Black lives, we have a lot of work to do to connect that struggle to the parallelisms of Euro dominance or colonial domination in the collective discourse and in our inheritance of from one of the articles I read from Dr. Shilliam of our collective inheritance of inferiority, meniality, and unintelligence. And so this is where I'd like to just leave us and bring us all into the discussion.
Good. Thank you very much, Professor Stelling. I mean, you raised quite a number of important issues, which I think Robbie Shilliam will address as we go along, issues about protests, students' engagement in protests, and issues about whiteness or blackness in the academy. But before we go to the conversation that I will initiate between myself and Robbie Shilliam, I would like to welcome Unyere Ideme, who is a professor of English as a second language, and she has a PhD in applied linguistics and is a poet. She's going to be reading one of her poems called Black Bodies. Unyere. Is he around?
Yeah.
It's okay.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. When Sinfree approached me to read a poem during a session like this, I was kind of surprised and wondered what poetry would really contribute to the discussion. But I didn't want to disappoint him, so I agreed, and I thought I would read something out of an already existing collection that I have. I toyed around with a couple of poems, but then I decided that, they were a bit too general, and I would write something new and sort of more specific to the topic that we're going to discuss today. So the title of this poem, which by the way, it's still a work in progress, okay, is Black Bodies. They traverse the halls of learning, dressed in the fine livery of diversity. This meandering of Black bodies juxtaposed in public spaces, once deemed a distant speculation. They exude an array of talents and values, a coalition of experiences to break the monotony of homogeny and enrich the base. Yet, between the segregated enclaves of the past and the lofty citadels of future aspirations stands the stark reality of the present, of the veiled truth behind the warm speeches and friendly gestures, of the bitter reminders of their mandated status by legal decrees and amendments without which they would have no presence, of the constant questioning of their expertise and scholarship, of the unattainable parity dictated by the status quo, of the subtle microaggressions and the dehumanizing stereotypes that make them the tokenized pieces on the board game, ornate and strategically placed for optimum exploitation of their invisible labor. They are the pawns of social marginalization and bureaucratic politicization. They are the objectified targets of secret glances through half-closed doors. They are the subjects of quiet whispers in the alleys of power. Nonetheless, this massive wave of dark bodies, invincible in its pursuit, ebbs and flows to defy the current. As the wind of change blows in new directions, the swollen tributaries of the epistemic quest cascade into global waters. This journey, begun in the ages, is far from over until Black bodies find their pedestal. And I guess that's why we're here today. Thank you.
Yes, good. Yeah, thank you very much. It looks like a number of themes are beginning to come, are beginning to get foregrounded. And one of them, which I want to use as an entry point, is a discussion about what Robbie calls Black cognitive incompetence. Robbie, can I begin by asking you what exactly did you mean by Black cognitive incompetence in your article?
Thanks, Sinfree, and it's really great to be here with everybody. I'm excited about the conversation and where it's going to go. I've got no idea. So, the cognitive competency is probably a bit more of a contemporary term for something which I think is probably underwrites a lot of the colonial racial order, right? Mm-hmm. And that is about an ability to reason in a way which is adequate for the present, right? But beneath that, actually, which is virtuous, right? And so we can think about that in terms of some of the founding debates in race in the 1400s about conversion of Jews and Muslims to Christianity, and whether they were so-called heathens as well, and whether they were competent enough to understand that Jesus Christ was their Lord and Savior, right? And we know all the kind of histories of the way in which conquest comes with conversion, right? So even from there, and even in Las Casas, you find this thing about are they able to are these non-Christians, non-Latin Christians, are they able to reason, right? So there's a base about virtuousness with it, which then shifts. It shifts in a lot of ways, right? But I mean, what one shift we can think about is the late 18th century, when that competency becomes linked to the ability to improve, right? And to improve one's environment. And that's very much linked with all the Scottish philosophers, classical political economy, Adam Smith, Ferguson, all these guys, right? And it becomes a more kind of profaned metric about a competency to be human, right? So very much in the kind of Sylvia Wynter vein. Reason, rationality, and humanity are interlinked and adjudicated consistently, right? And that's one of the underlying things with colonialism. And then by the time we get to the people like Malinowski, this is all about development. It's all about, does development, are these people, do they have a cognitive competency by which they can undertake and experience change in a orderly and servile, to be honest, fashion? Or is the only way that they can deal with change coming out of colonial development one of disorder and revolt?
Okay, if I continue with that, in the preface to your book, The Black Pacific, Bambara, for example, raises the following point. He says, what would theory look like if it was going to be created and written by individuals who are not normally expected to be theorizing? So if the argument is valid, my question to you then is, what does theory look like for you if you are writing from a different perspective from ones who normally are dominant in theory formation?
Oh, what a question, man. I'm not sure what it looks like. I've sometimes tried to play with this thing about living knowledge traditions, right? Okay. Or let me put it like this: there is a attenuation of what counts as theory right? Which political theory, especially social theory too, is quite complicit in, whereby theory becomes an author, and even Foucault becomes an author, and Foucauldians treat Foucault as an author, right? So it becomes individualized, it becomes written, right? And it also becomes written in a format which is notably theoretical, which mainly is an abstracted vocabulary, right? And along with that, theory then becomes not so much about doing, but simply about thinking, right? That to me is the place that we would start to think about how we might rethink theory, right? So, for example, you know, one of my favorite examples is Amy Ashwood Garvey, so Marcus Garvey's first wife, right? Who was an incredibly consequential figure in Pan-Africanism throughout the 20th century, was there at very pivotal times in, for example, the Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, where she is the only person who raises issues to do with gender at the conference, right? She is way more responsible than Marcus Garvey for recruiting people, people off streets in Harlem, wherever. She's, unlike Marcus, actually a Pan-African, and there's a slight distinction one can make between being a black nationalist and a Pan-African, right? She's a Pan-African. She travels the world. She has all these designs on writing books. She talks about race, color, class, gender, propriety, everything. She promises to write all these books. In the end, the only thing of any consequence which is publicly available is her kind of, you know, self-serving autobiographical note about how she started the UNIA, and also a preface written by Sylvia Pankhurst, the anti-fascist Ethiophile, and about a book that Amy Ashwood goes to write about women in West Africa but never writes. Now, Amy Ashwood Garvey could never be a theorist. You get what I'm saying? But her theory was practice. How was it that she was able to communicate with and persuade a whole swathe of different peoples, black peoples of different nationalities, different classes, different locations, to come join the UNIA? How could she do that? She wasn't theoretical. The International African Service Bureau, which was the famous body comprised of George Padmore, C.L.R. James, all those boys who you know, were at least in the Anglo world the vanguard of the intellectual struggle against Italian fascism in the 30s. They formed in Amy Ashwood Garvey's parlour, which was the oh my gosh, I can't remember it now, the name of it, the Florence Mills nightclub in London, right? So was Amy Ashwood just a cook? Or did her intellectual work actually help to gestate and direct some key Pan-African practices and traditions of thought? You see what I'm saying? Now, political theory couldn't say anything about Amy Ashwood Garvey because there's not a text. It's not written in an abstract register. You see what I'm saying? So how many more Amy Ashwood Garveys are there?
Okay. That then leads me to another important issue. Let me quote you. Say when you're talking about sort of decolonization, etc., and you say that what does decolonization mean both in theory and in praxis? And how is it distinct from other forms of anti-racist organization in institutions such as universities? And why has it gained traction in universities? What does it mean to apply a term that emerged from a specific historical, political, and geographical context to another context? For example, what is the difference, that's my own addition, between decolonization and discussions about diversity and inclusion? So let's take one at a time. What is the relationship between theory and praxis in decolonization? And then institutionally, I think something that is relevant to the place where I'm speaking from now, what is the nature of the relationship between decolonization and discourses of diversity and inclusion?
So I think the first thing to talk about, and we can talk about this more because I'd love to hear what people think,
yes,
is the way in which the university, especially from the mid to late 1800s onwards, becomes the site wherein, and this is especially the case with the liberal arts tradition, wherein you are, when you do liberal arts, you are it's being affirmed for you that you have that your mind has a salience and a efficacy whereby the whole of society will benefit from it, if not the world, right? So there's a certain claim about doing liberal arts, which is about, the classical thing about a liberal education, is the cultivation of the mind, to serve humanity, right? Now, what's interesting is that other institutions wherein that could happen become hierarchically subordinate to the university, right? At the same time, the university is an incredibly segregationist institution. So if you just think about, the debate between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, right? The debate is fundamentally about what place should Black people have in higher education. Should it be a place which is simply about technical vocation, or should it be about, the edification of the mind and and the furtherance of humanity and all that good stuff, right? And what's very interesting is that you find from the 1860s, 70s onwards, you find that a lot of Black students in the US, what do they want to come to university to learn? They want to come and learn the classics. They want to come and learn the Greeks and the Romans. Why? Is it because they have drunk the Kool-Aid and they think that the only font of human civilization has been the Greeks and the Romans? Maybe a few do, but I don't think that's really in their mind. What's in their mind is, if we are to be treated as fully human, and if to be fully human is to be able to competently reason about the world in generally consequential terms, then we have to prove that we can do the classics. We have to prove that we can do the Greeks and the Romans, right? So I'm saying all that just to say that the university then takes on, if you like, a particular, and I don't want to be functionist about it, but anyway, particular function of colonial rule, and it's settler colonial rule, which is moderating and distinguishing who are the reasonable groups and who are the groups who are not reasonable, meaning who is able to think about their own situation and others in a competent fashion, and who can only ever be thought about.
Okay.
Right, and that distinction then leads into the decolonizing thing.
Okay.
And if you think about, say, the body of thought which has come to us in various ways through Black Lives Matter, you can start to think about the stakes at play in this. You know what I mean? Like, communities which are police can only ever be thought about, and liberals can only ever feel bad about them.
Okay.
Right? And then say, well, let's do something about it. But what if those communities, you know, have traditions of thought which are not only illuminating their own situation, but illuminating of the broader structures which everybody falls under? That then means that we have to start, we have to think about decolonizing the academy, so to speak, as one element in a broader reparation of power, as Professor Sterling said at the beginning. This is about power.
But where then does, this is my last question, where do discourses about diversity and inclusion fit in there?
Yeah, I mean, they fit in, so I mean, there's a couple of ways. I mean, I've always, like, in some of the kind of institutional work that I've done, I've rarely led it with a language of social justice. I've always led it with an institutional language of pedagogy, competency, metrics, you know what I mean, and all that, because I just know these people don't understand the social justice thing, right? So on the one hand, that language can be used, you know, instrumentally to do certain things. On the other hand, at the same time, it's a language of deferral. It's bring people in a particular way, just like in you know, colonial times, there was a native intelligentsia. Bring them in, make sure they have stakes in the system, make sure that they are educated in a particular way, and anything which breaks from that is seen as disorderly and irrational. Okay,
good. Thank you very much for an exciting conversation. Raphael, I've done my part. You can. Thanks a lot.
Okay. That was a great initial conversation. And now I'd like to open for a general discussion. And I don't see any questions here in the chat box yet. So if you'd like to ask a question, just please let me know, and yeah. Or while people are still formulating their questions, perhaps I could start with one. And in a way, it relates to a point that you were making, Robbie, before we started the discussion itself, about the differences between academia in the UK and in the United States. And I'd like to ask if you could perhaps try to bring back that discussion by establishing a parallel with the point that you make towards the end of your article, when you talk about the importance of not having this ideal concept of an academia when we think about movements requesting for status to go down, but it would be more productive, or it would be the condition without which it wouldn't be useful to actually engage with the legacies and the dispositions that you present, the three dispositions that you present in the article. So could you perhaps,
Yeah. I mean, I think that, well, I mean, let me start by saying I think that an actual global history of the colonial heritage of higher education or universities has yet to be written, and so really, I wouldn't be able to make any kind of synthetic argument. You know what I mean? I get a little bit wary about that, right? But all these people are talking to each other. I mean, that's for sure, right? When Oxford in 1807 puts out its famous kind of defense of a liberal education against the instrumentalization of university, right? And then Yale does the same thing about 2 decades later. And in both of those, what you can see is a defense of a particular, I would call it a caste, actually, because it's a race and a class at the same time, right? A particular upper class kind of white male thing, you know, to keep university in the hands of those people, right? And so in many ways that I think resonates across a lot of areas. And then of course whiteness doesn't become phenotypical in the straightforward biological way. It becomes a kind of a mode of thought and action, right, in terms of exclusion and segregation. That said, there are distinct differences. So for example, you know, a lot of the post-colonial stuff in the Anglo Academy initially came through Commonwealth literature, right? Why Commonwealth? Because in the UK, you know, there is this very entrenched idea that all the bad shit, pardon my French, happened in the colonies, but England, nah, it never happened there. It was always crazy people who went out to the colonies, right? So there is this preservation of a pure, unblemished heart of civilization, even in the midst of empire, which is very much what underwrites a lot of the kind of English cultural class, if you like. So if anybody's ever done any archival work on British colonies, it always goes something like this: a custos or a governor has lost, is now convinced that there's going to be an insurrection in the end of the world because he heard drums at night. You know, the night before he heard drums, he's convinced that all the natives are now going to come and kill everybody. He writes to the colonial office in, you know, apocalyptic terms, right? The colonial office, there's a debate between some dude called Smith and some dude called Jenkins, and they say, oh, Jones has lost his head in the tropics. Oh, it must be all the gin or the rum or whatever. It must be the heat. You know, of course he's talking rubbish. These dudes ain't going to have a revolution, but send a warship just in case, right? So in other words, there is this consistent hiving off of all the craziness, the violence, the irrationality which comes with colonialism to the colonies, right? And so the English heart of empire is never sullied by all the badness that goes on in the colonies. So now when post-colonialism comes from Commonwealth literature, it first comes from Commonwealth literature because it's all right to talk about race in South Africa. It's all right to talk about race in Jamaica, but it's not all right to talk about race in England. That's rude, right? So now, one can kind of compare and contrast to the US, right? And I'm not in any way wanting to evaluate the US as better than the UK or anything like that. But I am saying that, you know, there is a reason why, even with all that struggle, Black Studies found a place in the US Academy, and it has never found a place in the British Academy, nor in the French Academy, right? You know, if you're in the French Academy, you do Fanon. You don't do Fanon for politics or you'll get beheaded. You see what I'm saying? So there's something about the heart of empires which is slightly different to the settler colonies and the colonies, some of which then become empires themselves, no doubt, right? And that's not a good or a bad thing, but it does make a slight difference, right, in terms of how conversations about race and the legacies of colonialism are articulated. You see what I mean? So I think that's one of the big things that I'd want to say, Raphael. And I also think it's very conjunctural and contingent, right? So I could see on the chat we got some Brazilian peeps here, and you know the stuff which you know the changes which you know under Lula were made to fund more, in quotes, diversity in the university has made a significant generational effect, right? Which are now under threat. You know, with Bolsonaro, right? So you couldn't talk about the university in Brazil now in exactly the same way as you could talk about it 20 years ago. You see what I mean? And so these demographic shifts linked to policy are very, very important too. And I often get the sense that even when you see in the US, the Republicans or some on the right, you know, kind of bewailing the fact that universities are the seedbed for all the liberals and the hippies and all that, you know, what that is part of a larger, that's a larger elite concern about white replacement. You see what I mean? And it's not so far distance from some of the liberal concerns about that, you know, which is why inclusion is always fine, you know what I mean? So long as it doesn't disturb the hierarchies, you know. So, and I think that kind of links in some ways to the poem, the poem that Unieri said at the beginning, you know what I mean? This sense about walking through architecture, actually, but not ever having been able to change the architecture.
Yes.
Yes, I think let me just jump in here and let me give you some figures. I can't remember whether I got them from you or I got them from somewhere else. In the UK in 2017, there were 18,510 full professors, and there were only 85 who were Black, and there were only 20 who were women. And in applied linguistics, since the passing away of the Nigerian professor called Tope Omoni, there's no full professor of applied linguistics who is Black in the UK.
Yeah. And I mean that but what there is, and then you see, I think in those terms things are way better in the US, right? That's for sure. But structurally, it's very similar. Yes. So if you go down to, you know, assistant prof, you know, then you've got more Black, brown, more women. If you go to contingent faculty, way more. Then if you go onto campus and you look at who's doing the cooking and the cleaning and the security, do you get what I'm saying? So that's the same across. You see what I mean? So I think it's like basically that the UK has managed to better preserve its pure white heart than the US, but that the structure is very, very similar. Even in terms of who gets grants, the funding of certain programs. I mean, you know, we all know that things like gender studies, Africana studies, are ones which are going to be disproportionately hit by all the cutbacks in budgets this year and the next 5 or 10 years, right? You get what I mean? And so that's the architecture. You get what I'm saying? That's the architecture, right?
Right.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. We have now some questions in the chat, and the first one is by Basse Antia. Would you like to ask the question, Basse?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Basse.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I was just wondering if you see any commonalities between the movements in South Africa around roads and, you know, Black Lives, Black Students Matter and all of that, and what we've seen in Oxford and the statues falling here and there in the US. Any common threats?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, Bassett. What do you think? I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Well, I think this is, it's interesting that all of this is coming together at about this time. So there's a coming together, I think, of a number of forces trying to bring about change, making it possible for us to hear voices that have typically been suppressed in higher education and elsewhere. So I mean, we've seen the thing in Oxford, right? But I'm not quite sure, given your location in the US, do you see similar things happening?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I do and I don't, right? So, I mean, I think the links between the South Africa roads must fall and the UK roads must fall, mainly coming out of Oxford, are quite obvious, primarily because, you know, there's a lot of South African people in the UK. You know, it's that simple, and a lot of Southern African people, a lot of African people, whether they were born there and their parents weren't, or whether they come in straight, you know what I mean? So that kind of immediacy is very important to actually think about, especially in terms of the organizing that people have been doing, right? The way in which the movement has had, and I'm not necessarily like this, but there is an argument about the movement, which is that it became, the movement in South Africa became, it had a moment where it could have been a movement to crack open all the structural inequalities from apartheid, and then it became a movement for, you know, an elite movement, i.e., give us our place in the elites, in the elite class, right? And I think that's a little bit unkind, but I think there is something to be said about concerning about that, right? That it becomes attenuated to and this is what often happens in the post-colonial world, right? That broader-based issues or movements become channeled into a movement to say, well, we want a space in what you've got, you know, and screw the rest, screw all the other structural issues, right? Interestingly, in the UK, in the universities which have by far the most black and brown students are not elite universities. They're like what you would call in the US community colleges. But all the Roseman's-Ford stuff happened in the elite, you know, the equivalent of R1 universities in the UK. So again, that's a similarity, which is, I'm not dissing it, I'm just saying we need to be attentive to that, right? The difference, the big difference between the two is that in South Africa, there's the land question, and in UK, the land question is moot, right? And that is a massive difference. The difference between the UK and South Africa and the US now is another very interesting and important difference. So on the one hand, the statues thing is uncanny. So, you know, when I got to Hopkins, there's a you know, because Baltimore is basically a southern city, man. It's a city on it was the gateway of the South, and you know, all gateways are a little bit more crazy and acid because they're the gateways, you know what I mean? So they're more the thing than the thing itself. You get what I mean? You know, so from what my friends tell me, you know, if you were coming on the train down from Philly, you'd have to get off in Baltimore. You'd have to segregate and then get back on the train to go into the South, right? So Baltimore has that kind of thing. Now, Hopkins, which was initially a kind of like, you know, a kind of abolitionist kind of university, nonetheless is in a very white racist city. There were two statues. I don't know if they were from the 1930s or 60s. One is to the north of campus, one is to the south. The one to the north is, you know, a statue to the gallant women of the South, right? And then the statue to the south was, what's his name? Lee, General Lee, is that the one, the guy? You know, one of them generals, right? Now, after the uprisings in 2015, overnight, what they did is they got rid of those statues, but they just left the plinths, right? Which, in my mind, is actually the best thing, right? Because it basically haunts the whole environment. It haunts it, right? But anyway. So this was happening, you know, just around my campus. So very similar things. What's the difference? The difference, and this is where I have a kind of a fraternal critique of the US Academy, right? And it's not a critique of people, but it's a critique simply of the situation. Is that especially when it comes to Black studies, one of the payoffs, if you like, and I understand why it would have to have been like this, was that you would bring Black studies into the university, but what you would do is you would nationalize it, right? And you would get rid of its global moorings, right? Cold War, all that kind of stuff, right? So that what is a very intellectual, global, you might call it Pan-African or global intellectual tradition becomes attenuated into a nationalist tradition, which I think we're still recovering from, right? Such that issues about empire are always very difficult to gain traction in the US, in the left, right? Amongst critical Black studies even, right? They're very difficult to gain traction. Right, and that is the difference between the US and the UK and South Africa. So, you know, where you got the land in South Africa, you got empire in the UK and in South Africa. But that question of empire, right, is diminished in the US, and it's partly to do with the politics around the inclusion of things like Black studies. Now, and there's plenty of people who are working on that. Don't get me wrong. I know this is not news to anybody, right? But I'm saying when you look at the statues, right? The statue debate in the rest of the world is about imperial figures. In the US, it's all about the South. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be about the South, but I'm saying if you look at the South, you should not look at the South except looking at it in a global perspective. Look at it, Louisiana, French Caribbean, Texas, Mexico. Do you get what I mean? Philippines, right? You know, one of the reparations ideas was relocate all Black people to Hawaii and to Philippines. You know, so like, I'm not saying there aren't immediacies which always have to be held in mind, but I'm saying one of the things which has diminished our debates in the US is that, and when you go to other places, you find that the US debates, even if they are per force dominant, and that's simply to do with the power of the US. That's not to do with the power of African Americans, right? But when they are dominant, they always have to be remixed. They never quite work. They don't work in Australia, Aboriginal people. They don't work in the UK with Black people from either the Caribbean or African continent. They don't work directly even in South Africa. Even in South Africa, which is probably the closest, right? I'm sorry about just ignore the crying. That sounds bad. I'm a terrible father. Just ignore the crying.
I've tried to organize here people who would like to ask more questions or make comments, and the next one up is Limario. And then actually I forgot to add someone right after Limario. That would be WJD14 with a question comment about RMF images. And then it continues Busi, Susan, Canavalil, and Juliet. So Limario, please.
Okay, you may already have answered this, but let me first situate where I'm speaking from. I'm speaking from one of the elite universities in Brazil, and in spite of what you mentioned that Lula made changes demographically to education in Brazil, I would say this happens more at an undergraduate level at universities than at a postgraduate level, where very little change has occurred. And so in my university, for example, the selection process into the postgraduate courses, MAs and PhDs, is still done through interviews. So there, you know, so what I'm talking about is visibility. So I'm wondering here if it's not already a lost cause to prove cognitive equality when the problem is ontological visibility. Right? And
Yep.
So what I'm saying is that, as you
Yep.
mentioned, this ontological invisibility is, you claim it's produced by power, right? So what do we have to do? Do we have to change the power structure to produce, to generate the ontological visibility, or is it, this is a whole discussion going on in Brazil at the moment. Is racism just epistemic, or is it ontological?
Yeah, I mean, Mario, those are really important issues, and very similar actually to I would say the UK and even the US outside of particular, you know, study areas, right? That inclusion has always been at the bottom, and the structural impositions stay in place such that they never cascade up, right? I have a couple of friends in Brazil who are you know, come in black Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian coming in through the Lula thing, now trying to do PhDs. And you know, I can see that that's a struggle for them, right? I think the question you raise is a question which is not actually, at least in the university, it's not best. The focus of it doesn't lie so much in the philosophical question about ontology, right? It lies more in a strategic question, right? About how, what universities you can kind of take over more easily, if you like, what spaces within universities you can take over more easily, right? How you link those to wider social struggles and global struggles, right? And in what registers do you do that? So maybe I'm a pessimist, but I'm a great believer that there's no point. You can't talk to Caesar in the language of social justice. So don't even bother. You know, talk to Caesar in the language that Caesar understands, and then do your thing otherwise, right? And there might be issues to do with that. There certainly are, right? But what I'm saying is I would never have a debate about ontological blackness with a provost. I mean, I just, you know, so maybe I'm being pessimistic about it, right? But what I'm basically saying is I think your question is a question of strategy. You know, it's not that the questions about blackness are not important. Of course they are, right? But once that debate has been had, then the question is a question of strategy. You know, the debate itself does not give you the strategy. And that's where I feel sometimes when I look in some of the literature on race in the academy at the moment, to my mind, sometimes, and it might well be unintentional, but sometimes what it does is it dwells on the ontological to the point where I start thinking, so is this so that the strategic question never gets asked or addressed, right? And I'm always mindful of C.L.R. James's sympathetic critique of Black studies, you know, which is that be careful that it doesn't simply form another administrative elite who patrol, you know, their space, you know, but never utilize the space for transformative purposes, right? And I'm wary. If I looked at myself, I think I'd probably do that. I probably do that a bit. I won't lie. But I'm wary of dwelling on the ontological, you know, for fear of too long, for fear that what it does is it actually takes us back into those very colonial debates, debates about actually independence, which is all about, well, look, you white guys have got all these wonderful houses and these wonderful, wonderful jobs and these wonderful institutions. Let us in. You get what I'm saying? And there might even be a critique of race, which appears to be extremely radical, right? But when you actually look at it, ultimately it's serving that, right? So I'm not saying this as if I'm the good person. Do you get what I mean? But these are concerns and worries that I have about doing this work in the academy, basically.
Can I just add something that I wasn't so much referring to the philosophical.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the strategic. But
yeah, sure.
To think of the strategic is also to think of bodies. And so I was thinking, so when the black body presents itself in a selection process, it's already preemptively excluded.
Yep. No, absolutely. So, which is why those peeps in the late 19th century wanted to be able to speak Greek, so that their voice would betray their body.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so from strategy to images, and Bill Dewey.
Okay, thank you. I'm an art historian, grew up in Zimbabwe, and I was—
my wife is from Zimbabwe.
Yeah?
Mangwanani.
Momonani. So, okay. We're already on the same page. So I'm going to redirect things a little bit because I love your kind of contextualizing the history of the images that have fallen. Roads must fallen. But I'm going to suggest that rather unusually the images that are falling are figurative. But there's another category of images that people have been kind of ignoring, but are equally linked to roads in particular, and that also kind of extends over to architecture. And so there is in Oxford, there is a very prominent place called Rhodes House. There are also, and there are Rhodes Scholars. In South Africa, there is Rhodes University. And in Cape Town, there is another institution called Groote which was Rhodes' residence. In especially Rhodes House and Groote they are full of images of great Zimbabwe birds. And Rhodes acquired one, and it's the only ancient bird from Great Zimbabwe that's not been repatriated to Zimbabwe. South African governments say it's a problem because it's part of heritage and so on. But it's the only bird that's not been repatriated. Rhodes was obsessed with that bird and used it as a symbol of biblical Ophir, because he thought Great Zimbabwe, couldn't possibly have been made by blacks, et cetera. So he continually used that image of the bird, and it's been repeated at Oxford House. If you ever go to Oxford House, it's on the top of the dome. It's throughout the place, and et cetera. So my contention is that those are equally kind of obnoxious images and so on, rather innocuous. But what do you think it will happen in terms of renaming things? Renaming things, Rhodes University, Rhodes House, Rhodes Scholars, et cetera. Like that. I've written about this, and I'll send you the article that I've written. But my question is, kind of extending beyond the physical likenesses of Rhodes, Confederate generals, etc. The naming part.
Yeah. Now that's really interesting. I mean, but Bill, what do you think? Because you've written about it. I mean,
personally, I think that people don't understand that these kind of symbols continue and that there's an obsession with them. The more kind of things that people do think about are the names, like Rhodes University, Rhodes House, and so on.
Yeah, I get you.
But in the United States, people are now saying, no, we need to move on and talk about naming it as well. So personally, I'm hoping that will happen, but at the moment, it's just the physical likenesses.
I get you. I see. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of things to do with that, and it's also to do with the, in that article I sent around. The reason I said it like behind the statue is because the statue is a figure which represents a far deeper complicity of the academy in race and colonialism, and very much linking back to what Mario was talking about, about this, the ontological presence of blackness as being something which would destroy, cultivated spaces, right? So the first thing to say is that the names, along with the images, and the people I know at least who have been pushing these struggles, these are levers to effect broader, more deeper, more consequential change, right? They're not simply to rename, right? So many of the people who were doing the Roads Must Fall stuff from, you know, since 2015, you know, one of the things they wanted to do was to actually, for example, put these statues in a museum, recontextualize them and open it to the public, or keep the statues up but recontextualize the statues underneath them. So instead of, you know, a plaque to King Leopold, you know, commemorating the glorious diplomatic encounter between Her Highness this and His Highness this at 19 whatever, you know, it's like, this dude chopped off people's hands, murdered millions, right? Do you see what I mean? And that is a public intervention, which is kind of ongoing, you know what I mean? Until it doesn't mean anything. And when it doesn't mean anything, it means the problem's solved, the deeper problem's solved, right? So I think that's the first thing. And I think that would apply to images as well, right? But I've got something a little bit more to say about that. When it comes to names, you know, I kind of wonder whether things actually need to be named. So we've got a whole thing at Hopkins. We're very behind in a kind of twee elite liberal way that you know, Princeton finally did get rid of its Woodrow Wilson whatever. We've got a Woodrow Wilson undergraduate prize because Wilson did his PhD here. Now we're probably going to change that name. You know, the question is, do you change it to another name? Do you need a name? I mean, seriously, do you need a name? I mean, I get it. If someone endows money, they want to live forever through that. So you haven't got much choice, right? But Wilson is gone. Yeah. So do we need to have another name? Can't we just call it, you know, the undergraduate prize in international relations, you know, dedicated to peace or something like that, right? So that's one thing I think, you know, this kind of hagiography, we want to be careful of it where we can be, right? The last thing to do with images is that images can work two ways, and I'm entirely with you, Bill, about I mean, and that Rhodes House in Oxford is the most creepiest place I've ever been in my life. It is fundamentally disturbing at every level, and it's very difficult to put your finger on why. It's like it's a mausoleum to white supremacy. That it really is, right? And then part of the co-optation of those symbols, like the bird, you know, is part of that, right? But I kind of think that images may have a bit more mutability than persons and names, right? I had a friend who used to live in he's gone now, but he used to live in a very small island in the Mediterranean called Mallorca, which is part of the Balearic Islands in Spain, right? And Mallorca was very piss poor for most of its history. The west side of the island was mountainous, and that used to be the poorest, but now it's rich because of tourism. But anyway, there were all these little kind of Spanish villages in the mountains there, one small road, crappy little houses, huge church, and then one or two massive townhouses, right? So we knew one of the people who owned one of these townhouses, and he brought us in and he showed us the rafters, right? One of the rafters, and it had voodoo symbols in it, right? Etched into the rafter, yeah. And the story was that the guy who built the house in the first place was a peasant. Then after the Haitian Revolution, when all the sugar industry moved to Cuba, he went, like many people, to Cuba, made his fortune because he became an overseer or something in that kind of level, right? Made a lot of money. Came back to Mallorca with the money, built the townhouse, set himself up as the big kind of squire and all that. So then the question becomes, why did he etch in these, you know, symbols of the law, you know, the spiritual agents in the rafters? And one of the stories was that, you know, well, you know, it was him just coming back and, you know, putting a bit of exoticism into his Spanish house, right? But I always thought the reason he did it was, and if you read a lot of our colonial archives in the Caribbean carefully, I'm not just making it up, that he went there, he knows he did a bad thing, he made his money in a bad way, literally off the backs of other people. He was protecting himself from the consequences of what he did. And he was protecting himself through the law because he entirely believed in them. You see what I'm saying? So, and you see that a lot of the time in colonial archives, that actually, really, when you scratch it, they think this shit is efficacious, that it works. And that's what they're worried about, right? So in other words, I think there's a mutability in these images which exceed the name. Do you get what I mean? So I can imagine that these images can become rallying places for struggle far more than the names, possibly.
Okay, and now we have Busi who'd like to ask a question about the connection between Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa and the UK.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question actually on that. I'm just going to add some text, I think, some historical background to the connection as far as I can recall it. The UK part of Rhodes Must Fall was actually initiated by the same person who initiated it in South Africa. That was Untokozo Garvey. He had actually, the first part of it was when he went into a restaurant and bought something, and when they gave him a receipt and he was expected to give the waitress, the white waitress, a tip, he wrote on the receipt that we will give tips when you return the land. So connecting the issue of the land with, which is what you said at some point. But the other side of the Rhodes Must Fall is that the Rhodes issue started way earlier than reported, because in the early 2000s, the rugby team at UCT refused to play because the black players refused to play because they said that they didn't want Rhodes to be hovering over them and looking at them while they play. They felt that it was dehumanizing. So there is that. But again, that is again the figurative nature of statues, what they represent. The fact that even if the laws have been removed, the powerful images still represent those laws that have been removed from the books. Now, what I wanted to comment on was the fact that I think Lynn Mario had started that conversation about black bodies, that when they present themselves to an evaluation process, they are already excluded. That's 100% true. But then when they are in sort of let through the door to enter, they are not expected to use their traditions of thought. Instead, they are expected to continue the traditions of the dominant group. In fact, they are only let in so much as they are continuing with that tradition, which is what makes diversity and inclusion very different. You can have a diverse group, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have got inclusion, because inclusion is likely to bring about those different ways or traditions of thought. Why we may have diversity, but with the continued dominance of whiteness, is simple that we are not. There are also many areas in which we are closed off in some ways. Take, for instance, the issue of publication rates, the issue of who is being cited. The citation rates of black bodies is very limited. Who holds editorial positions in knowledge production is again reflects a particular group of individuals. And it is those individuals who have a say in giving direction on what goes ahead and what doesn't, So those different traditions of thought, those different traditions of knowledge production, those different methodologies, data sets and all that are already closed off. So with that setup, from my point of view, we'll continue with maybe talking about where we have diversity, but whether we will achieve inclusion is something else, because if we are only going to be able to achieve inclusion if we are able to disrupt the structures that are closing us off. And we can only do so if different communities are allowed to use their traditions of thought, their ways of knowledge production, and if those ways of knowledge production are brought into the academy and are allowed into the academy. That's my only 2 cents. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm sorry, I missed your name.
Busi?
Busi. Thank you, Busi. Yeah, that I mean, and I think that's the that's the main point I think I'm trying to make in that article, where it, and I think this is the case in the US until the 70s, but it's probably still the case in the UK. And I would say, probably, I would imagine it's still the case in South African universities, at least in the Cape Towns and the Wits and all those, right? That knowledge production, that debates and prognoses which arrive out of living knowledge traditions which are not those imposed by colonial rule are almost always coming on the outside or the edge of the academy, right? And there is an absolute, how you explained it is exactly the reason why that perpetuates even, right? And you know, this idea about legibility is really, really important, right? And I also think that it can even, I wouldn't say go further than that, but I would say that there is a, okay, let me put it like this, Bossy, sorry, let me put it like this. And it's speaking to your whole argument, right? What really made me very attuned to that was when I worked in New Zealand for 5 years, and in New Zealand universities, every university has what they call Māori studies, right? So it's kind of like indigenous studies, right? So Māori are the indigenous people of New Zealand, right? Now, to the rest of the university, Māori studies was like kind of like anthropology or maybe language training, you know, one of the two, right? The peeps in Māori studies considered themselves to be a mini university, right? And in fact, they didn't give a damn what the rest of the university thought of them, right? But their whole premise was anything in the world from molecular genomics to fertilizer to you know, ethics can be interrogated, and in principle can be interrogated and explained through what they call Māori maturanga, which is basically Māori knowledge systems. And that was the premise, right? So every system of education has premises, right? You know, the one that we work in has certain premises about it being, you know, impartial, it being skeptical, it being meritocratic. You know what I mean? All those premises are bullshit, but nonetheless, those are the premises, right? So Māori studies, people say, well, we got our premises, right? Our premises is that anything in the world can, in principle, not before the fact, but in principle, be explained through Māori knowledge systems, even the stuff that you guys do in chemistry or philosophy, right? Racism is real and colonialism has had effects. Those are the premises, right? So that so deeply impressed me because it wasn't even saying, I am going to come up with a mode of thought which is absolutely antithetical to your colonial, white, heteropatriarchal, rational, objective bullshit. Right? Do you see what I mean? Like, you know, I'm going to be the exact opposite of you. I'm going to be so exotic that you just won't even be able to say anything. Right? You know what I mean? It wasn't even starting from there. It wasn't a reaction to anything. It was a retrieval of something. You see what I mean? And that retrieval was, we can do what you can do. We do it in different ways, but we can do what you can do. And we do other things too. Right? And of course, that's the reason why most of the people in New Zealand universities had, you know, could only approach Māori studies in one of two ways. Not all, but most, which was either just not even talk about it, pretend it's not there, or just say it's language. It's just language training, right? And I you know, know from a couple of people that I know in very vague terms, I know that there is a growing movement in South Africa about indigenous, you know, knowledge systems in university, especially to with environment, agriculture and all that, you know, but all of which have, for example, ethical predicates and all that kind of stuff as well, right? And I think where you left us is where we need to go. And it's not just for the sake of knowledge, right? Although it is for the sake of knowledge as well, right? But it's also to attend to that question of power, which Cheryl started us off with. I used to work with someone in New Zealand who was part of what they called it the Black Power Gang, right? It's called in Māori language mangukaha, right? And the Black Power Gang it had a social justice ethos, which was chaotically applied by a bunch of urbanized youth, all of whom were extended family, but all of whom had been entirely left out to dry. So in other words, it wasn't a kind of a snick or anything like that. It was, you know, it had its very, very rough points, right? I'm not saying it didn't. That's, you know, really serious issues, right? But nonetheless, it did have a social justice mandate underlining it, and it still has today. Now, I work with the spokesperson, right, for that, and he would often, you know, like there's a thing like a quid pro quo, right? You know, I did this for you. Now, what are you going to do for me? So I would say to him, well, come up to the university and just take a class with my honours students. And in that university, all those honours students were going to end up being in the legal profession. They were all going to be, you know, basically in court arguing something about Māori people having, you know, stolen something or land, or, you know, from the prosaic to the you know, to the fundamental, right? And he always picked up the offer because he knew that there would be one thing that he would leave them with. So he'd come up, he's like these tattoos, they call them moko, right? You know, tattooed, rough-looking dude with a mohawk, comes up to the class, you know, my little honor students, right? And he talked to them about race and the justice system. And at the end, what they would always say, the students would always say, was this: when he first come in, I thought, oh my God, what are we going to learn from this dude? Oh my God. Or some of them would say, this is going to be great. I'm going to be it's going to be buzzing, Brad, right? At the end, they'd always say, I will never again presume that the way in which someone looks determines the way in which they think. I will always presume that these peoples and these communities have some knowledge about their situation and themselves, some knowledge which is not just for them, but which has general salience, right? And of course, that is a learning moment which is very important when you're going to go into the legal profession, right? You know, when suddenly in front of you is some some Maori kid with tattoos, and then he starts saying what? So you left us where the power and the politics comes into this whole thing. And I think for us in university, if there's one contribution we can make, it's that. It's very simply to impress upon people that, if you're talking, for example, for the Brazilian peeps, if you're talking about how are we going to get past this impoverishment, environmental collapse, it's the peeps in the favelas who are going to explain to us how that happens. Not individuals, not vox populi, nothing to do with that, but the systems which have been intellectually put in place, the praxis which have been put in place to creatively survive the worst impositions of violence and oppression. Those are the systems which is going to get all of us through. You get what I'm saying? And that's where the power comes, and that's where this pithy phrase decolonizing gains any meaning, if it's going to gain meaning.
That's a very powerful and inspiring message that leads us to almost the end of our conversation. We have 3 more minutes and still 4 more people lined up to ask questions or
I'm sorry,
comments.
I answer questions really long. I'm sorry, you just have to interrupt me, man. I'm sorry.
And the next one up is Susan.
I'm going to be very brief, Raphael, because I agree. Let's maybe hear more questions and hear more from Robbie himself. Hello, Robbie. I'm from South Africa. I'm a sociolinguist, so I don't even want to open up the can of worms of decolonization and the language issue. Just want to say that at Northwest University, where I'm proud to work in South Africa, we are working towards exploring multilingual pedagogies. We are exploring that people use all the languages they bring to the class to generate knowledge and to share knowledge with each other. Maybe you would see my comment later on. I just wanted to say thank you about this notion of this dual mandate. That if we think about decolonization now, I think it's a powerful tool for us to say, what are we building and what is the development agenda if there should be one? So I just think it's a powerful tool coming from your article that can actually structure some of our thinking also in South Africa. The last thing I want to leave us with is I was really relieved in December 2015. I don't know those of you who follow South African politics. It was the Feast Must Fall summer. And I was preparing to serve as a leader in my faculty in 2016. And I was thinking about this whole, how do I serve my students and my colleagues in this Feast Must Fall atmosphere in 2016. And I was asking a colleague of mine who was also part of the struggle, and he looked at me and he basically released me. And he said, look, you're a white old Tammy, a white old auntie. You will never again impact that discussion. You can sit back. You have trained the children. They will lead you into the future. And I think this intergenerational thing to me is really interesting as well. And us, the older guys, we need to respect what the younger people are bringing to the table. We have supported them. We have trained them. We must trust them. Thank you.
And perhaps we have time then for one final question by Juliet before we round it up.
Thank you. You'll allow me to speak off camera because of internet issues.
Yes,
I'm speaking from Kenya. Yes, I'm speaking from Kenya. And I must say that Robbie's article resonated well with what I've experienced in Kenya. A background is that in Kenya, we have the British syllabus, which covers most of our education. And yes, so then that means that for me, there are certain issues that were raised by Robbie that I find to be applicable in my case. And I agree that discourses about decolonization, just as Busia said, should begin with conversations about race, equality, diversity, and even inclusion. of inclusivity in the academia. But my question is that for us to think about decolonization, should we first of all then look at the lack of diverse perspectives in our syllabuses? I'm a student and I'm speaking as a student. So when I look at the syllabuses that I'm made to cover in my African institution, most of, for example, the authors or the scholars are from the global north. So then I believe that we should first start thinking about the lack of diversity in our syllabus. Then we also acknowledge the existence of certain inequalities in our academia. For example, I'm a woman. There are certain issues that as a woman, I'll be able to access easily, certain scholarships. So these are issues that I believe we must first of all tackle before we go globally and start proclaiming that we need to talk about racism, yet in our institutions, these issues still occur. And once again, I'm speaking as a student. So probably, Robbie, what can you say about that?
Thank you, Julia. I mean, I think you're thinking the really important points. I mean, I don't think there's much of an answer to that I can give, which you haven't already got. But maybe one thing I can say is that you're lucky to have not just in Kenya, but in East Africa, and especially Anglo East Africa, a history of debates and struggles around exactly that question within the university setting, right? So you got the famous debates in Dar es Salaam College in the late 60s, early 70s with Walter Rodney, Giovanni Arrighi, other people about, coming out of Nyerere's Ujamaa thing, self-reliance. How effectively they were literally talking about it because it was just after independence. How do we decolonize the university, right? Which were all colleges of London at the time, right? That's the kind of, from the kind of 40s onwards, a lot of these national universities now were all colleges of London. Interestingly, just as a little aside, Raphael, can we go over a couple of minutes, or do we have to kind of yeah? So and Juliet, shut me up if I'm going off course, right? But anyway, there's in the Caribbean there was a University College at the West Indies, right? So that was the kind of colonial thing, and it was a college of University of London. University of London has LSE, King's, UCL, all these at the moment, but it used to be that initially all these were colleges of London, which is why you guys have still got all those very English curriculums, right? And examinations as well. So in Jamaica, Rastafari started to go up to, Bob Marley, people, we started to go up to the university in the 50s, right? And basically agitate, right? Now, in Jamaican polite society, I'm not from Jamaica, but anyway, in Jamaican polite society, the university was called UC, because it was University College of West Indies, UC. So Rastafari always called the university U Blind, right? because all they ever did was teach like an English curriculum, so in the late 60s in Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, under that whole Nyerere experiment, there was a whole set of debates which lasted for over a decade about how you decolonize university, and they're very important and interesting to go and revisit, because you'll be surprised at how contemporary they still are. We think all this stuff is new. It's really not. And it had a real bite to it as well, because of course one of the questions was, if we are going to decolonize university and get rid of all the English curriculum and be against, neo-imperialism, do we give Nyerere's party a free ride? You see what I mean? So it was a very complicated and very very attuned kind of debate. And then of course, and you know, initially there was a whole ecology of universities, colleges, which made up the East Africa kind of system, right? So the Makerere in Uganda was, you know, of the same ilk as Dar, you know, and I'm sure the Kenya one was part of it as well, right? So it's not like how we think of it today as a national thing. It was actually a very regional ecology. And then of course you guys have got your decolonizing the mind guy. What's his name? Oh my gosh, what's his name?
Ngugi.
Ngugi, I'm sorry, Ngugi. You know, so yeah. So you guys have got all that. Interestingly, that book was a lecture series at the University of Auckland, and in New Zealand, where they were having a whole debate with Māori people about the retention of Māori languages. I remember sitting in a thing once. So I was bringing a Kenyan playwright called Wakanyote to New Zealand. He was doing some work with some New Zealanders around issues, and we met in one of the Māori meeting places, and and what you have to do is when you meet, you have to sing a song or sing a poem or, you know, something to introduce it. This is me, right? So the Māori person was there, and the Māori person did their Māori thing. Wakanyote had come, that was me, but then Wakanyote had come with a white New Zealander who was married to a Kenyan who had, in the 90s, this white New Zealander had been part of the kind of, you know, resistant movement against the kind of overreach of Moi, right? So them guys knew each other. So there was this wonderful moment where the Māori person sang his song, and I knew what that song was, and it was basically a song about self-determination. The New Zealand guy stood up, sang this very famous, but I can't remember, Juliet, what it was now, but very famous anti-colonial kind of song from Kenya, right? With Wakanyote joined in, right? Nobody understood all the languages, but everybody got the point. So there's a you guys actually, you know, if you're talking about, if you're saying, well, you know, all these debates going on in the UK, all these debates going on in the US, and all debates are useful, you get what I mean? But you're entirely right that you can start where you are, because in fact you guys have got one of the earliest, the contemporary debates about decolonizing the university, which should be retrieved.
Right.
Would you like to say the final words, Makoni?
I would like to thank everybody for finding time to attend this series. I know that for some people it's late at night, for others it's early in the morning. It's a problem that we'll continue to have, because if it's a global forum, there are different time zones, right? So that's one of the issues. The other thing is we are going to have a series of follow-up discussions. For example, Ngugi wa Thiong'o in December, on December 19th, will be coming to talk about decolonizing literature. So it will be interesting if Robbie is going to be around to listen to.
Oh, I'd love to listen in on that.
It will be interesting to hear what he has to say. Right. And it's interesting how all these arguments are now beginning to coalesce around a number of different themes. Last week, our previous session was focusing largely on issues about race, and the issues about race came up again in this particular discussion, which I think is important because it shows that even if you're talking with a different scholar, the concerns come back to issues about race, power, the institutional dynamics, and how to move forward. And I think that is really good. And I think Juliet's argument about what you do as a student, the institutional dynamics of student protest, student activism also is an important issue to bear in mind. Other than that, I think I must say thank you very much to everybody. Okay, thanks.